All right. So I think we can maybe start, Roshali.
Perfect. Let's begin. Yes.
All right. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Talking About Transitions dialogue on building urban resilience in India's informal settlements. At Transitions Research, we really believe that people are at the heart of climate change solutions. And for us, this discussion is about people, about communities that are the heartbeat of our cities and yet stand at the front line of climate risks. I think to begin with, we want to run a quick poll to understand our audience here today. We're so grateful that so many of you all could make it. Um, and so if everyone can maybe put in and give us some input on your relation with building resilience in informal settlements. If you're here just to learn, if there's some work you've been doing, um, and that will give our speakers also a better sense of who they're speaking to. We'll just take a minute for everyone to fill in the poll. Okay, I think uh, just a couple of people who are still filling it in. Shali, is the result being is visible to everyone as well?
Yes. Especially the panelists, I'm sure.
Okay, perfect. So we have a lot of people who are doing research and working on partnerships. Of course, a lot of people who are doing related climate work, but also a lot of people who are just here to learn and engage with something new. Um, Okay, thank you for those inputs, I guess. Vishali, I think we could maybe end the poll. Share those results. And so we just want to take a minute at the outset to sort of talk about why we're having this conversation. Um, and um, and since we say that people are at the heart of these conversations, take a minute to imagine what it would be like waking up in the peak of summer in a home made of tin sheets. By midday, the inside temperature has soared past 45 degrees Celsius. The house is like an oven. There's no reliable electricity, so fans or coolers aren't an option. Water is scarce, and when it does arrive, it's unpredictable. And then a few months later, after this summer heat, the same home is under a foot of water after intense rainfall. Drainage systems are overflowing, flood water is creeping in. And on top of all of this, you have no legal claim to land. So rebuilding means starting again from scratch. This is what reality looks like for millions living in informal settlements in India. Communities that power our urban economies and our cities and yet remain the most exposed to climate risks. They face heat, flooding, water shortages, all while struggling with insecure tenure and limited access to finance or infrastructure. And so the question we really find ourselves trying to engage with today is that how do we build and scale lasting solutions that truly center and work for these communities? Last year, a couple of us at Transitions Research worked with a team at GRP, Global Resilience Partnership, to do a landscape study of urban resilience solutions across the global south. We scoped 130 solutions. We did a survey, interview, and an in-depth literature review to identify what are these key opportunities and barriers for scaling solutions. And I think while there were many interesting takeaways, one of the key takeaways was that this space is incredibly fragmented. There are practitioners, researchers, funders who often work in silos. And as a result, you miss opportunities to learn from each other, to collaborate for greater impact. And so what we're really trying to do through this dialogue is to bring together these very different insights and perspectives. And we're really thrilled to have a fantastic panel of three very accomplished people and people with very different and very rich work experience. And while they have very long bios that they've all sent to us, I'm going to try and very quickly introduce them so that you have a chance to hear from them directly. Our panel today has Dr. Parag Agarwal, Dulari Parmar, and Rishika Das Roy. Dulari is an architect and urban designer with Yuva. She leads climate justice initiatives in informal settlements across several cities. She's played a key role in climate hazard mapping and community-driven climate vulnerability assessments. She's passionate about mapping literacy for marginalized groups and has helped communities leverage data for advocacy. Rishika Das Roy is leading sectoral strategy and investments for the ICC, which is India Climate Collaborative. She has 14 years of work experience across the policy cycle, from designing to implementing and evaluating climate programs. She's worked with Oxford Policy Management, BBC Media Action, and the Government of India, supporting smart cities and Swachh Bharat missions. She brings deep expertise in behavioral insight, policy design, and of course, the reason we reached out to her primarily is climate investment strategy. And lastly, Dr. Parag Agarwal, who's a seasoned entrepreneur with 35 years of global experience. Parag sir founded Janajal in 2013, which is a social enterprise revolutionizing tech-driven water access in India. He patented something called the JJ Suite platform and Water on Wheels initiative, which provides decentralized, sustainable drinking water solutions. In 2024, he launched the Big Water Protocol, which is a blockchain-based initiative for incentivizing sustainable climate action while expanding safe water access. So on that note, we're really excited and glad to have the three of you with us today. For the benefit of the audience, we thought of breaking up this discussion into three segments, do a couple of opening remarks from everyone to build some context. Then we go into the nuances of building resilient solutions in informal context. And then we move on to the larger question of what it takes to scale these solutions. So to start off, a common question to the three of you, and we'd be interested to know from your experience, what is one major barrier you think in building resilience in informal settlements? If you had to name one critical challenge that keeps coming up in the work you do, what do you think this is and why? And maybe we could start with you, Dulari, and then maybe move on to Dr. Parag and then Rishika. A couple of minutes, if you could touch on this.
Yeah, I'll not take more time, but thanks a lot, actually, Evita, and especially Ashali for thinking of us. And maybe I'll directly go to answering your question. I think all climate action work revolves around the issue of power and who has power over it. So, and in our climate justice work at UA, we recognize the power imbalance that exists within the climate space. And I think what we intend to do is shift the power from the existing normative space to the people who are actually getting impacted by it. And within power, I think, and when working in urban areas, land becomes a critical issue. And I think when working in areas as contested as Mumbai, Guwahati, we understand that land becomes central to every climate action that we take. So that is the biggest challenge: who has access to land, who has access to knowledge over land, and how do communities access that land for not just climate action, but for existing and surviving in the city. So I'll end my answer there. I hope I've answered your question.
No, thank you for that. And I think that's brilliant context for us to then build on in subsequent questions. Dr. Parag, maybe your idea of the biggest challenge or barrier.
Well, I think Dulari touched upon the fact of inequality, and we've always approached, being practitioners. We've been working on ground now. I mean, I personally for almost 28 years in the social sector, but more so with Janajal for the last 12 years. And we believe that democratizing communities through equal access to resources is the key. And therein lies the key. The biggest fundamental gap, and again, you could call it inequalities, but I'm trying to define the inequalities. So it's very important that everybody has access to those resources, and it is those inequalities which really create the gap, and then it creates the oppression eventually. Unfortunately, they have rights, but they have no right. So the land they live on is not theirs. Maybe the electricity connection they have is not legit. They have no access to a legit water connection. And of course, we look at things from food. Food everybody has these days. So as in, because you have to buy it. So that is not a problem. Nobody gets access to free food, but their fundamental rights are deprived, and that is where I think if that can be addressed, and this is exactly what we've done through the medium of safe water. So we've forever advocated that for us, water is not a product. It's not a commodity. It's not a utility. It is a medium. It's a medium of change. It's a medium of empowerment of a woman, empowerment of her family, empowerment of her children, and so many things. I can go on and on. So the amount of cascading and cumulative benefits and collateral benefits that just something as simple as safe water can provide is mind-blowing. And that is something that I think really needs to be understood. And I'll be very happy to talk more about it going further into the conversation.
Definitely. And I think that's brilliant context to get started with. So land for Dulari, sort of inequality and social hierarchies from Dr. Parag. Rishika, the major barrier that you see.
I think it's perhaps not unique in any way, and everyone probably knows this, but it's important to state it, nonetheless. The biggest issue, the way I see it and the way, practitioners see it, is the fact that there is systemic and systematic exclusion of these communities from formal urban planning processes, right, and governance structures. So if there is no legal recognition, if there is no tenure security, if there is no equal access to basic services, you are locking in people who are so visible in your day-to-day lives in cities, taking away their visibility, making them invisible, and therefore trying to build a narrative of resilience which overlooks the needs of millions. And that narrative is just not going to work, right? And the reason why that's not going to work is when you try and match demand and supply. And I'm really sorry to use that kind of framing. But if we really do look at how climate finance is flowing, you're not going to be able to look at chronic underinvestment until and unless you let what we think is informal into the formal conversation. So that barrier is exclusion. That barrier that we need to solve for is perhaps even data, right? Because they're both two sides of the same coin. Who you're excluding, when you're excluding, what risks they have, what kind of access they need, all of that needs to be documented. Until you don't let them into your formal way of planning in a co-governance kind of model, you're never going to know how to solve for those gaps. So it's slightly macro, and I'm sure all of us have sort of grappled with this, and this is not new for anyone, but I just wanted to state that up front.
Absolutely, fair enough. And I think it's a very important context to then talk about building these solutions and then going on to scaling them. So if I can then use that to segue into this question of what it takes to build. Maybe Dr. Parag, I can start with you. Your work with Janajal is transforming access to safe water in informal settlements. Could you walk us through how your model builds resilience on ground? Who are the key players you collaborate with? And what do you think have been the most effective interventions in terms of impact?
So So the one word, if I can use one word to say what was our greatest USP was decentralization. What we did was we created an intervention that hinged on decentralization and decentralized access to safe drinking water in an equitable manner. So each word over here is extremely meaningful. Simply because what we did was, forever there has been a lack of access. So first of all, I want to start by saying, everybody refers to water as water. But the way we look at water is it's actually divided into two categories. There is water and then there is clean water. And both are as different as chalk is from cheese. It's very important to understand this bifurcation because people often and all the time talk about water access, a lack of water access. We've always said that 100% of India lacks access to safe water or clean water because those who are getting it are buying it. And because their affordability quotient is high, they're able to mitigate that gap very comfortably and not feel the pinch. But those who cannot afford their expensive packaged water is the community which is really struggling. And that is where we decided to go out and bridge the gap. I mean, for 12 years, we've been practicing. We understand that having put the same water, the clean water in a bottle with a swanky label, with a swanky celebrities advocating it, we could have sold it for 50 rupees a liter. We've been practicing, we've been adamant about delivering water to people's homes at their doorstep for 1 rupee a liter. And it has been one of the greatest challenges, and that we've had to the lure of wanting to break out of that 1 rupee shackle and add a zero to it, if not 2 zeros per liter, has obviously been there. But we've resisted and desisted that simply because we want to stay on the sustainable side. We wanted to eliminate single-use plastic. We wanted to do away with all the unnecessary costs associated with supply chain and distribution and consumption of water. Why should the common man buy a bottle of water for 20 rupees, of which 18 rupees is inconsequential? The water within contained is only worth 2 rupees. But all the rest is trash cost. And I'm calling even taxes and labeling and everything else as trash cost because that's not what they're buying into. So the point is that, this is what we've tried to overcome. We first created the iotization. We created our own tech platform. It took us 8 years to create a patent. Just last year in June, we were awarded the patent by the government of India. So we today have the most comprehensive and complete water management platform that traces water from source to treatment to delivery to consumption and has the KYC, the date timestamp, qualitative, quantitative, transactional parameters captured on chain. So we've actually got 33 data points that we collect for every dispensing transaction we've done in the last 12 years. We've delivered more than 200 million liters of water. We have 2 million subscribers. We have 1 billion data points that have cumulatively, we never thought it was that much until we started counting recently. And that's what really then, I won't segue into big water because that is the new baby and that's the next level evolution of Janajal. But I'm just going to take a pause here and kind of allow the conversation to roll, and then I'll come back with the other things we are doing. But I think just to answer that or to summarize what all that I said, the two things that we really leverage very strongly was decentralization and technology. And when I say technology, we had to again resist and resist the lure of not putting in too much technology so as to cannibalize our own operating costs. Because we had to keep an eye on that 1 rupee per liter that the end user must not have to pay more than. Therefore, our technology also had to be extremely curated and pulled back and held back. So oftentimes we used technologies that are 2.5 version and not the 4G version that are available out there because we didn't need the 4G version. We're happy with the 2.5G version. So again, just sharing with you, but happy to have the others speak as well.
Sure. And if I can just quickly follow up in this, when you speak about decentralized delivery, who were key partners that enabled this reach?
So we are the only selected we are the only innovative technology selected by the government of India under Jal Jeevan Mission and Amrut 2.0.
Okay.
So urban and rural deployment and implementation in a decentralized fashion, last mile delivery of safe water to people's doorsteps. The government of India is our greatest partner. Now, besides that, we've worked with the USAID. Besides that, we've worked with IRCTC. Besides that, we've worked with private sector companies, corporations, foundations. We worked with the GSMA Innovation Fund, Netherlands. We work with other Fortune 500 companies in conjunction with them to implement their CSR vision or their ESG mandate. The short of the long is I come back to that point. Water for us is not a product. We never went out in cookie cutter mode and operated by saying this is what our product is. There is no product. There's a solution. And that's the solution is customized to suit the interest of every stakeholder involved, where everyone walks away feeling a winner.
Fair. This is very helpful context to begin with. And sort of moving from that model, I think, Dulari, maybe we can talk about Yuva's work, and a lot of that is hinged on climate justice and community-led resilience. We wanted to understand how does Yuva approach this collaboration with communities? What do you think? What have you found to be most effective strategies to co-create with communities for long-term sustainable solutions? Would love to hear from you on that.
Thanks, Evita, for that question. Just to give a little quick background of Yuva. So Yuva has been working under habitat, labor, youth rights, child rights since past 40 years now, since 1984. And very recently, we started our climate justice work. And that so happened because we were hearing from the community, and we had also spoken with Ashali about this, that they were not able to cope with the increasing impacts of climate change, whether it be flood or heat or, torrential impacts of cyclones. So it was from the communities that we realized that, oh, there is a need for this project, and there's the need for us to also integrate it as a part of our work. So under the human rights framework, we are also now, since the past 4 years, working on climate justice. To start with, I think urban poor have always been receivers of climate action, whether it be some EV program or some infrastructure that's coming into the city. It's like Rishika rightly pointed out, they're absolutely invisibilized, and beyond that, their participation is not being considered. So one of our key intervention or key thought process going into this project was working with the community. Now, how do we work within a civil society space? I think, I don't know how two of me have joined, but I think this one part of our working in this space is also understanding that we'll get a lot of backlash because we're civil society and we work with the communities. We're not academic institutions or think tanks who can research and come up with scientific ways or approaches to work in the climate space. So we're always dealing with this backlash of think tankization of this process of the climate space. In fact, their number have grown twice in the past few years. So coming from that background, we have on our own end developed a community model for working in the urban informal settlements, which is called Community Climate Action Planning Framework, which is a 4-pronged process where we approach the community from a much more macro lens, where we understand climate hazards at the city or a regional scale, overlapping with them the informal settlements in the city. So as again coming back to Rishika's point, that they are invisibilized, they are not mapped. There's no spatial database on informal settlements in the community. So we started our climate justice work with mapping informal settlements across Mumbai and its region, then overlapping climate hazards on the bastis and realizing where these climate hotspots exist within the city, where heat, rain, cyclone, sea level rise impacts overlap in one basti. And then so one of our work we piloted in Ambujwadi, which is again an urban poor community located in Mumbai along the west coast, which experienced extreme heat and flooding throughout the year. So one way to approach this was initiating our work with a community-based vulnerability assessment along with the youth from the community. So we had learning and training exercises on how do we unpack climate, and also shifting the onus of climate action not to the people, but to the state, to the government who is responsible for a lot of this action. And through that, we mapped vulnerabilities in terms of climate and social in the Basti, which led to developing a community climate action plan. And the CCAP, the Community Climate Action Plan, is basically a vision of how and what are the priority areas of action in the Basti, and how can they be dealt with locally in collaboration with the local government. So a lot of this work is happening in Ambujwadi, and since 2021, we have now expanded this work in 3 other cities, which is Navi Mumbai, Vasai, and Guwahati. Another part of our work is also integrating climate-informed spatial planning. So very recently, in fact, since 2022, Navi Mumbai's development plan was released, and later Panvel and Guwahati's in 2024. So Yuva has been involved in spatial planning processes since early 2000s, where we have looked at 9 different city development plans and how they can be socially informed, as in how there can be homeless shelters, public housing, public infrastructure. But beyond that, very recently into these 4 cities, we're also looking at how spatial planning and climate can be overlapped. For instance, where do bastis exist within the city, and advocating for that. But beyond that, where do flood hotspots exist within the city, and how can we demand the government or the planning authority to allocate land for flood mitigation or heat mitigation, and likewise. So I can go on and on about our spatial planning, but I'll maybe come back when we also hear from Rishika.
Yeah. Thanks, Sulari. I think that's very helpful I think for people who are hearing of Yuva and their work for the first time, very helpful context. And then with this perspective from like for-profit and a non-profit model, we come to the question of who finances and how this is financed. And I think, Rishika, we wanted to talk about in the RISE report that we've done with GRP, one finding was that innovation exists, solutions exist, but when it comes to scaling, that is where the struggle is. And this is most often due to funding constraints. You get that initial grant amount or the amount for the pilot, but then what happens when you want to scale? So we wanted to understand from funder perspective, what makes informal settlements in particular a tough space for climate funders? And how do you see groups like ICC maybe working with NGOs and the private sector to sort of plug that gap?
Okay. So this is slightly lengthier response perhaps from my end, because it kind of needs a bit of unpacking, right? So first is, why is it that the private sector is not moving towards this space? And that I'm talking about climate resilience or adaptation in general, because we can't really skip that to get to the informal part of the conversation. So if we look at global climate finance data, you will see that there is a deficit of $69 billion in adaptation finance, right? That's where India stands. We are missing $69 billion annually on climate adaptation finance. Now, that might seem like a huge number, but just 6 states in India, say Chhattisgarh, Tamil Nadu, Himachal, Odisha, so on and so forth, just they need that quantum. So the data in itself is not complete in terms of what our resilience requirements are. Now, if we try and map that against what kind of finance cities receive in general, it's about 1.2% towards urban adaptation. So we're seeing that there is an issue with the data. There is an issue with not understanding what comprises climate adaptation finance, what specifically donors are looking for, and that there is no taxonomy for it. So if I were to tell you that, raising the plinth of an informal settlement so that, there's better stormwater drainage, it is better suited during monsoon, so on and so forth, is an adaptation measure, you and me might naturally think that yes, that makes sense, right? That's one of many things that can be done. Or if I were to come to you and say that, we need to green public infrastructure, because it's not just about giving access to water, but how will the person from a temporary shelter walk in either through heat stress or through some kind of hydromet disaster to a place to access clean drinking water, right? So there are many ways of unpacking this. What might be obvious to practitioners is not obvious to the private sector at all. So what they need is demonstrable proof that there will be some kind of ROI or return on their investment. They need demonstrable proof that what they are financing or funding has a clear taxonomy that is recognized by the government, that is recognized by other institutional financiers, right? So now adaptation in itself or urban resilience in itself is so complex that no one's really created this kind of taxonomy just for India. So that's the first gap. After that, we get into what data-backed financial structures, models, or incentives might look like. Now, when we speak to the private sector, there is this constant need to communicate in terms of numbers, and that's where we often get lost. What we need to do, and a large part of what ICC does, is sees how we can blend private capital and de-risk private capital by infusing philanthropic capital with it, right? So we all know philanthropic capital is not something that is return seeking. So in that sense, it becomes much more agile, it becomes more sort of risk tolerant, and it's not necessarily in that ROI wala box where you're constantly looking for a return on your money. That's not the purpose of philanthropy. So all of our conversations in the past 2 to 3 years post certain COP measures, like the Conference of Parties in Climate, has been on how we move beyond the PPP model, which a lot of us are aware of, and introduce the fourth P, which is philanthropy. And when we try and infuse different sources of capital, we can deal with the first barrier, which is that of return on investment, because this kind of capital is able to quantify co-benefits. And I'll give you an example, right? So all of you who work or know of the work that SEVA has done or Mahila Housing Trust has done, especially on climate proofing homes from a heat stress perspective or from a heat related insurance perspective, there is data that shows, especially from the MHT study, that every rupee invested in climate proofing homes can save informal workers 5 rupees in heat related income loss. So once you have pilots that give you this kind of language where it becomes explicit that every rupee done with the purpose of not only building adaptive capacity and resilience of these communities also leads to some kind of other co-benefit, be it livelihood, be it health, be it, income generated or income saved, that's automatically making a case for scale. So that's one part of it. The second part, if you move beyond ROI, is how do we structure these kind of interesting blended finance models or mechanisms that layer, say, public funds, private investment, and philanthropy all together. Now, I'll give you another example, and this is perhaps one that's more personal because this is something the ICC or the India Climate Collaborative has done, is that when we talk about loss and damage, right? And we were really thinking about urban populations, the informal sector, how do we really quantify loss for a community where data doesn't exist? And there was this ADB report, and it showed, I think this is 2019, it's a pre-COVID report, and it showed that already in India, every time there is some kind of disaster or APDA, as the NDMA and then the SDMA, that whole APDA disaster framework, as we like to call it, every time a compensation goes out from either the central or the state government, it's actually 2.5 times less than what is required. So in an informal setting, in an urban community, it takes an average family 19 years to recover from one disaster. Now, with climate change, you're going to be looking at multiple hydrometric disasters at varying different points and at varying different scales and intensity, right? So, if we really want to get the private sector involved, what we need to do is understand what kind of digital public infrastructure can we create around this conversation. So we went to an organization called Seeds, and we, with that kind of seed capital, or that catalytic capital that ICC provides to unique solutions, we came up with a disaster wallet or an e-wallet, which is the first of its kind in India, which not only looks at economic losses but also non-economic losses that communities really face, and that's going into our national repository of loss and damage, but it's also helping migrant workers, people who've been displaced, get access to compensation. So it's a good example of how philanthropy can come in, provide systems visibility, use certain tools such as data, technology, financial levers, build something that can be institutionalized. And when you institutionalize, ensure that the informal sector is a part of it. That's one of the best and easiest ways of making inroads. So there are multiple ways in which blended finance models can be used for scaling. But the point being that the bedrock of it needs to be data, it needs to be systems visibility, and it also needs to be understanding the nature of finance. So only if we understand can we sort of blend and infuse and create something unique that can be scaled. Sorry, I went on for too long. I'll stop talking now.
No worries, but thank you. I think that sets a very broad base and a very deep dive into finance challenges. And I think this segues very well into the next segment on understanding scaling. And I can see that people have already actually started putting questions in the chat. So we'll try and get into the scaling bit quickly so that then we can move to audience questions. Maybe Dr. Parag, we can start with you, and this round we'll try and keep it maybe a little shorter. On the question of scaling, how has the challenge of balancing social impact and financial sustainability as a private sector organization, like how has that challenge or that balance been created when it comes?
Hello, sorry, Evita, your screen is frozen.
Sorry, can you hear me?
We lost the last 7-8 seconds.
Yeah, no, so I'm just asking on the question of scaling, how as a private sector organization do you see balancing social impact and financial sustainability? How is that negotiated in the process of scaling efforts for a private sector organization?
It's a very difficult path. It is the proverbial Agnipath. I would never encourage anybody else to go down that path. But having said that, I would never move away from this path. I mean, so that is one thing to be said. But there is a constant need for viability gap funding, and I think Rishika made some great points. And I wish I could recall all of them and reproduce them, but I won't. But she touched upon the need for financing and unlocking more and more financing sources. And that is something which is very, very key. So again, I will only speak from the very micro intervention of making clean water or safe water available to people and to communities. And from that perspective, one of the greatest challenges has been centralized fundings bottled up in a centralized manner. But the need to deploy it is in a decentralized manner.
Yeah.
And by decentralized manners, I'm not referring to our intervention. I'm saying different communities have different needs. There is a different approach. It's a horses for courses approach. It's not a one shoe fits all approach. And I think that is one of the biggest impediments. Number one, as one of the points she said and stood out for me was the minus 2.5x of funds being released. Now, whether for Apada or for Aap Bhala, In both cases, the funds are
Okay.
always minus 2.5x than what they need. For the longest, I've had conversations with impact funds who first ask, what is the ROI? What is the IRR on the project? And I said, look, where does this question come from? You're an impact fund, we're an impact activity. If you support this activity, there is another ROI, which is called return of impact, which is what we can quantify, we can measure, and we've already proven that for every dollar that goes into making clean water available to communities, $236 is the commensurate return on impact over 5 years.
Right.
And it's not our assessment. This is a third-party US-based auditor's assessment on our projects and
Right.
similar like this. But they refuse to look at that. So I've sit on global forums and I've gone out and sit with the donors and said, all these guys sitting over here are venture capitalists in disguise of an impact fund. The reason why they run an impact, the reason why they run this impact agenda and impact charter is because they want to attract the LPs on the back who will
Right.
put money into their fund. But eventually they are running a VC approach because they need to pay themselves salaries and they need to pay themselves bonuses.
Right.
This gap is something that needs to be solved. And one of the ways, and I want to now take the next 2-3 minutes into talking about big water that we are doing, and we are trying to decentralize even financing sources. So we are actually, big water is a Web3 initiative, which as I call it, it stands at the intersection of the web of the universe and the metaverse, which aims to monetize data in the hands of the user by giving them clean air and giving underserved communities clean water at the same time. Besides healthy rewards on a daily basis for conducting a good, sustainable action. Now, I may have said a lot of things which may be a little confusing, but let me quickly show you a device. This is our DeepIn device. DeepIn stands for Decentralized Physical Infrastructure. This is the DeepIn model. This is our DeepIn device, which is an air purifier. Now, if you install this air purifier and you run it, and you share not your personal data, you share weather data with us, as your participation into the protocol, into the big water protocol, you will earn daily rewards. And at the same time, for every device, we will give 1,000 liters of safe water to underserved communities free of cost, not even at 1 rupee a liter. What are we doing? We've gone into a new universe called the metaverse. And we are trying to now create more avenue for revenue to bring that money into the mainstream activity and support people at the bottom of who live at the bottom of the pyramid.
Fair, fair. And I'm just gonna have to maybe stop you there.
Sure.
In this time, but very interesting conversation of where tech comes in also, as I understand, a key part of being able to scale these. But
Rich in tech. This is completely tech. There's AI, AR, ML, there's functions involved. There's a whole gap of tech which comes in now.
Right. Okay. And sort of moving from that private sector conundrum, Dulari, if we could ask you, not specific to Yuva's experience, but if you could speak for the broader nonprofit sector and for people who work in rights-based models, hinged on like community participation, what does scaling then mean for organizations like this? How does advocacy and co-creation, community mobilization, does it play a role in scaling efforts? Some perspective on that would be really great.
Yes, no. I would like to directly point out that working in a basti is messy.
Yeah.
And that's why it's often invisibilized or often not a part of the planning process, or not just climate, but any spatial planning or other processes. So usually the approach is, okay, this is so messy, let's get it out of our way. That's why we see a lot of evictions, because our governance and systems are yet not able to understand how to work in a basti. And beyond that, when you come at climate action, you see there are not just flooding, but there are multiple interlinked vulnerabilities. बस्ती में पानी नहीं है, gutter नहीं है, toilets नहीं है, घर नहीं है. So by doing any form of climate action, you're not really resolving the root cause. And that's why I think one of the important factors of scalability, that it not just has to respond to climate hazards or climate impacts, but it also has to respond to the interlinkages that exist within the basti. So it's not just open space and tree plantation, but also doing solid waste management in the basti, in that open space, making sure that storm water gets drained out of that open space so that that open space sustains for a longer time. So within the scalability factor, I think one of the important factors to consider is that these interlinked vulnerabilities of social vulnerabilities and climate change need to be addressed together. And when we did our mapping, we did exactly that we did not just map flooding and heat in the basti, but we also sought to understand the toilet condition in the basti, the sewage condition in the basti, the solid waste management condition in the basti, so that whenever we come up with an intervention, it's just not dealing with heat. Beyond that, I think one important factor to scalability is also to link to the existing processes that exist within the city. So in 2022, the Mumbai Climate Action Plan was released, and after which we were able to partner with WRI and TISS on Mumbai Urban Greening Initiative, which looked at urban informal vulnerable communities and how heat resilience can be developed in these communities. So then again, we started with an idea of, okay, let's do nature-based solutions in the basti. But over a long period of time working with the community, we realized that, everyone has different priorities. Men wanted a gym in that open space, whereas women wanted an area to sit. So, how do you negotiate these different ideas and dreams about an open space? And beyond that, how do you integrate the nature-based solution within this complex framework? So along with nature-based solution, we also looked at participatory, public open space, public realm open space creation. So it was not just tree plantation, but also enabling different factors. Seating area hona chahiye, wall painting hona chahiye, different forms of tree plantation should be there. And beyond that, we also looked at community engagement from a stewardship perspective, that because because the space is so less and the area that we're dealing for the open space is so less, that we wanted to make sure that everyone had their dream getting fit into the nature-based solutions. And beyond that, when we look at the intervention now in the long term, the people who are involved in the planning of the open space and now implementation are now able to take care of the plants even after you are sort of stepped out of it. So I think this stewardship can only be enabled when people are a part of the planning process right from the beginning. And this helped the scalability factor of it. So after we worked with the WRI, and then we, through our Chalo Basti Badle campaign, we garnered a lot of public funds to scale this model into bastis across city of Mumbai. So the same project was then, we were able to again scale it in different bastis across Mumbai and also in Navi Mumbai and Panvel. So the scalability, again, there were a lot of challenges through the way we learned, but along with the challenges, there were also these pilot aspects that we could replicate across different communities now, not just in Mumbai, but also thinking about replicating in different contexts like Guwahati or Akola, which is a second tier city. So yeah, multiple factors in scalability, but that was my short take on it.
Thanks, Tulari. I think that's very helpful perspective, and very few platforms I think that you get to hear from someone as diverse perspectives from the private sector, from the NGO. And I think a big finding from the RISE report is that these are two players that need to come together and work. And so And then I think Rishika, one quick question for you before we head to the Q&A, and I see there are two questions on finance for you. But you delved into the challenge with adaptation financing, but to sort of zoom in a little bit more specifically on informal settlements, from a climate funder perspective, what do you think for someone who's looking to do a project, an implementing agency, what is it in their design of their project that could make it more investable or scalable from a funder point of view? Like, what are things that could be done differently in the project design and implementation stage that you think could help?
So I feel like this is something that becomes a bit context specific, and it actually comes down to the whole ecosystem operating in that urban space, right? So who are the stakeholders? What does the local urban governance look like? What does civil society there look like? And what can they create together? Because what's happening generally is that a lot of the pilots that we're seeing in this space are not being able to scale, right? And they're not being able to scale because either they're not fitting that ROI framework that I was talking about, or they're not being able to get follow on funding, right? So they are not being able to catalyze. Now, three things that are working where I feel like we've been more successful pitching it to larger private scale or private sector investors has been around shelters, because everyone's understanding that there is an absolute need to work on good quality but low cost shelters, especially with the heat trends in India, right? So shelter and roofs, school roofs, etc., is getting some traction. The second big thing is looking at the green skills market. And that's something that we don't often talk about, because whenever we think of informal networks and we immediately start thinking of the circular economy and where informal workers fit into that, there is a massive opportunity to talk about green skilling and reskilling programs. So if it is something to do with the economy and creating green jobs, the private sector is willing to listen. So that's a good hook. And the third thing, perhaps, is not necessarily about a sector itself, but more about urban services. So if there's something specific to planning or co-governing services and access to essential services and how we can climate proof urban services, that's something again that the private sector is interested in. So if we're able to sort of work upwards from some of these three big pockets, and we're able to create more data, which helps us build a framework for what this kind of funding, where investing in informal settlements has actually been de-risked, we'll be able to crack better quality blended finance mechanisms. We'll also be able to crack what other cities globally have done, which is called outcome based financing. So we can, like, Jakarta's done this very well with, say, flooding, where private sector has been told that they'll only be repaid, or they'll be repaid more, like with a factorial advantage, when losses from flooding have been reduced, right? So such models can only come about when we go with what the low hanging fruit is. We try and match that with the needs of the vulnerable community, design something, make it robust, get the data from it, build a framework, build a narrative, and then try and scale that up in terms of ambition and in terms of ask. I'll stop.
Fair, fair. Thanks for that, Rishika. And there's a similar question on opportunities that since you shared that, I'd like to pick up from Dulari and Dr. Parag before we close this session. But very quickly, I think I will take the liberty to maybe condense and share some of the questions in interest of time. I think maybe Dr. Parag, this is for you from Amita Basu. She's asking that using blockchain versus sticking to low-tech solutions that cost less and work just fine, given the realities of tech washing and AI washing, and the high ecological costs of blockchain. What are your perspectives on the role of tech and big data in climate justice?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for this, Amita. The need to use blockchain is not opulence or desire. The need to use blockchain is verification, is authenticity. It is precisely to overcome the greenwashing and all the other forms of washing and the, let's call it, for lack of a better word, the fudgery around and surrounding data. Blockchain is what authenticates proof of delivery, proof of impact. It is very important to establish this and only then go on and be able to then attract more funding into a particular sector or into a particular activity. So that is where the use for blockchain comes in. I think the question about the high energy use and other things, emissions and other factors are not necessarily associated with blockchain. Those are associated more with data centers. And data centers are a different beast altogether. So I don't think we're talking about that, and that cannot be spoken of in the same vein. But blockchain, I mean, to be honest, we already have blockchain all around us. The entire COVID program of the world was run on blockchain servers. If our vaccination certificates had a QR code, that was actually supported by a blockchain server on the back. The vaccination program was QR codes. The COVID negative certificates were QR codes. Supply chain is all on blockchain. Everything is blockchain anyways by default. All we are doing is we are now bringing a whole new use case and to the blockchain technology. So blockchain has been around forever. That's not a new technology. It is new to the sector, which is what we're doing. And like I said, the need is not desire or just ambition or aspiration. The need is pure verification and authenticity. So that is why we are doing it.
All right. And I think there are two questions that are very similar on climate adaptation financing, which I'll sort of merge for you, Rishika. One is that a large part of Shikara Prasad asked this, that a large part of adaptation can come down to addressing development deficits. And given that development finance is well established, why can't we use the same language? Are we pigeonholing climate adaptation more than necessary? And then related to that is the problem that climate adaptation researchers are not able to speak the language of development appropriately, or is it that the evidence they are providing is not convincing to funders? So maybe if you want to quickly maybe touch on that together.
Sure. So, I mean, what I might say is actually a bit contradictory because this is quite, it's evolving, right? So, the first part of this challenge, and it is perhaps is just useful, that development as usual, and therefore development finance as usual, does not typically account for climate risks. So, development finance so far, whatever has been the current paradigm, has fallen short. And we see this every day in our institutions, in the way we look at poverty reduction, in the way we look at access to basic services, health, education, so on and so forth. So when you add that climate layer of risk, development finance as usual cannot cope with it both in terms of quantum or in terms of speed. And in order to attract newer forms of capital, we will have to put in that climate language. Otherwise, people are going to go on investing in development as usual. And those paradigms are going to start failing starting 2030, 2040, 2050. So if I give you the easiest example, and I'm sorry, this is a bit of a cop out. If you think of how infrastructure is planned in cities, right? And if we go the business as usual route and we're not climate proofing large scale infrastructure, then it's kind of a dead infrastructure, right? Because you don't know, if you're not if you know you're going to be hit by climate impacts and hydromet disasters and you're not planning for that, then that's development aid kind of wasted. So yes and no, we do need to differentiate climate finance from other sources of development finance, primarily because of this layer of additionality, right? The second point is, after we've secured climate finance, and this is where I contradict myself, is that we need to mainstream it back into sectors and subsectors. So climate adaptation finance is not useful unless that finance flows into sanitation and you create more robust systems in sanitation, unless that flows back into your, say, urban services. It doesn't flow back into how we cultivate food. So it kind of needs to converge and then decentralize again, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but very happy to take on follow-on conversations about this, because we are also learning about adaptation finance and what it means for the Indian context. And as I said, there are too many gaps and not enough studies, barring the one CPI has done, which has data for India. So we're not sure what is the best way to frame this, because framing is the only way that we'll get people to actually look into and financially consider climate risks before investments. Back to you, Evita.
All right. Thanks, Shika. I think that that's a helpful clarification, and I hope that answers the question put in chat. And I think just quickly to wrap up the one sort of question we were hoping to leave everyone with, because there are a lot of people who want to work in the space and want to know what are like untapped opportunities. And Rishika gave us three, even though we just asked for one. But Dulari and Dr. Parag, what do you think is one for someone who's looking to work in the space, private sector, advocacy, nonprofit? Like, what do you think is one very specific to the informal context space? What do you think is one key untapped sort of opportunity?
So,
Maybe Dr. Parag, if you want to go first, yeah.
okay, so now it's my turn to contradict myself. And that is the social sector. As a social enterprise, I think is an extremely relevant career option. It's an extremely potent career option. Yes, social activity is typically associated with charitable nonprofits, foundations, and so on and so forth. And that also is, I mean, I'm not pitting one against the other, but I think the emergence of for-profit organizations,
Right.
while remaining social in nature and in outlook, is a viable career option. Or sorry, you want to say something?
So no, I meant more in terms of solutioning. So a particular, if one is to make a career in the space, of course, but also if for someone who's looking to work on building a solution in the space of informal settlements. So say Rishika brought up green skills, urban services. Like you are working on clean water, what do you think is say a key
I
service
think
that was clear? Yeah.
work on anything that makes access to basic resources in an
Yes.
equitable manner possible.
Right. Right.
Now, it's difficult to pick one over another because there are so many.
Fair. Of course.
If you stick to that baseline, then
The
what
basic
happens
services. Right.
continue is there almost until perpetuity. So it's a
Right.
question you max out and where you think you cannot do anymore. But because then that is so circular and that's one of the reasons why, as an entrepreneur, I decided to go down the safe water route 12 years
Right.
ago.
Right.
Simply, I said in my lifetime at least, technology will never disrupt the need for water.
Water.
Always need to be consumed in its physical form. So yeah, if we can keep making it available, even to however small a micro community that we can keep, then we are relevant and we will stay busy for the rest of our lives. Now, of course, the desire is invariably to keep scaling up
Yeah.
critical mass, but that critical mass is a moving milestone. Always keeps getting reset.
Fair point. Dulari, very quickly, maybe a key untapped opportunity you think for
No,
action?
very recently, in fact, we are dwelling into just urban transition, whereas there is a lot of just transition conversation, but urban piece is completely missing. What goes in urbanization is always talks about decarbonization, nothing beyond that. And we're looking at coal mine closures, climate-induced migration. So we're looking at more and more people coming into the city. And then how do we deal with not only people, more and more populations in the city, but also the exacerbating climate risk? I think that's the bigger piece to unpack for cities. And the recent, like if you look at even research on JUT, it's largely from 2022 to 24. There's nothing more beyond that. So lot needs to be unpacked there.
All right. I think that's a fantastic note to sort of end things with. We wanted to start with the challenges and end with opportunities to act. At Transitions, Vikram is always telling us about being climate optimistic, because it's so easy to feel like the world is ending and things are in doomsday. But it's great to know that there are opportunities to act. It's fantastic to see people like the three of you acting and doing things on ground. And I hope for everyone attending, there was something interesting to take away from. Just a quick word of thanks to the three panelists for staying 10 minutes over time. Sorry for that delay, but for making the time and for bearing with all our back and forth emails. To the team at TR, who's always so supportive, particularly my colleagues Ashali and Angelina, who've been so helpful in sort of constructing this, and our comms team, Roshali and Niyati, who are behind all the exciting and great visuals that have put this out. And at our end, we'll be working on ways to put the recording out of this creatively and have more people engage with this. And at our end, I think figure out ways to take this conversation forward. So for folks in the audience, if there's something that you found interesting, you'd like to follow up with, I'm sure the three speakers will be more than happy to keep the conversation going. At Transitions, we'll be more than happy to keep it going. And yeah, on that note, I think thank you. Thank you everyone so much for making that time, and have a good evening. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thanks for
Bye.
inviting us. Bye.
Bye-bye.